Patria o muerte, venceremos.
Raúl Roa is the father of the revolutionary Cuba diplomacy. He's known as the Chancellor of Dignity. His best pupil is this man, alongside Fidel Castro. His name is Ricardo Alarcon, and since he was very young, he has worked intensely. He was the youngest ambassador to the United Nations, afterwards Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and for a lot of years the President of the Cuban Parliament. Not a lot of people has as many stories to tell as Ricardo Alarcon. Alarcon, you were an activist of the University Students Federation FEU even before the revolution, an organization loved by those who were part of it. In times in which you also worked with the Directorio Revolucionario and with the 26th of July movement, both against the dictatorship of Batista. Times in which the resistance against the tyranny was stronger than ever, all of which ended with the revolution triumph of January 1st, 1959. Describe those moments for us.
Actually, I got involved in the things of the revolution, as did many young people. When I was a student at the La Víbora High School in my neighborhood. My first activity I remember very well. Right after the Batista coup d'etat, they closed the offices of many student associations that existed all over Cuba then. So students went to the streets to protest. That was my first political action, so to speak. Later, in that way, I gradually became a member of the 26th of July movement, of the youth brigades of the movement that were in all Havana districts. And when I entered the university, I inevitably got involved in the university students' struggle. A struggle which, in my judgment, has not been emphasized enough. At the university, there was a great battle to make it a decent place for the university reform, and it went hand in hand with the political struggle against Batista then. The comrades who were leading, organizing, and promoting that twofold battle, the person who, because of his struggle and activities, became the leader of that trend was José Antonio Echeverría. At the school where I began my course, this struggle was rather complicated and tense. And the person who gave me orders and guided me was a student leader in the adjacent school of agronomy. He was Fructuoso Rodriguez. We became very close friends then, and in practical terms, at the university, I belonged to the group and trend which would later be the Students' Directorate. And of course, I continued having close ties with the comrades from the organization, even though I had been a member of the 26th of July movement since it was created in Havana. And I continued being a very close friendship with Fructuoso until the terrible day he was assassinated. We were really very good friends. Actually, I wasn't an FEU member. I ran for a post as instructed by Fructuoso, and I lost the election. But I was a sort of activist. I continued cooperating with him and the leaders of the FEU at the time. I got elected for an FEU post after the triumph of the revolution in the 1959 elections. But from that time to the present, I've lived through so many things in so many places. But that's the experience I hold dearest in my heart.
Why?
Because we were kind of crazy. After all, It is hard to answer that question. Why? A short question, but it is difficult to answer. First, because it was then I grew up and learned, and I have unforgettable memories from comrades who have been with me since then, although many of them, unfortunately, passed away a long time ago.
Had to do with the excitement towards the revolution that those generations had?
That's also something which sometimes is underrated. Young people then did things that may look very risky and unusual. After all, a youth is not supposed to conspire or fight, but to do other things. But it's been forgotten that such a trend in the university had the support of most university students. Because to become an FEU leader, you had to run in an election where anybody could be a candidate. And there were a number of groups opposing the Students' Directorate and trying to get them out of the university leadership. For instance, Jose Antonio won in 8 of the 13 schools that existed then. And after some research, we have confirmed that on February the 7th, 1958, the Havana Business School, among many others, was taken over by the students. They went out to the streets, clashed with the police. The school was in Ayestran Street, near Infanta Street. They clashed with the police at Infanta, and well, the same happened in La Víbora, the Havana, and other high schools. When word spread about the assassination of Gerardo Abreu Fontan, who was the leader of the youth section of the movement in Havana, and my chief. That strike began on February the 7th, 1958. It was spontaneous because students went out to do just what they could do. As soon as it was known he had been arrested, we all knew he would be killed, as he was, just that evening. And the only thing we could do was to go to the streets and shout, to cry, to try to create a situation that averted the assassination. Throughout February, the strike expanded to all public schools, to all private academies, to all private universities, like the Villanueva University, a Catholic university in Western Havana then. The strike continued in March. In April, we were expecting it to give momentum to the general strike on April the 9th, the workers' strike. This strike failed completely, and its aftermath was brutal repression in the cities. But the students' strike continued throughout April and into May, and it was only in May that our strength dwindled and schools opened one after the other. What does that mean? That a majority of youth then, including most of those who studied in private schools, supported those few others who, yes, could be seen as the vanguard and were facing the regime by taking greater risks. The level of support and unity, particularly in February, March, and April of 1958, was very high. Then came the terrible and inevitable setback period, but eventually the revolution won.
Cuando triunfa la revolución, Alarcón, usted When the revolution took power, you worked as a diplomat in the very early years of that process. And I imagine those were moments of creativity because you, your fellow diplomats, and of course the leaders of the revolution had to invent, to create the kind of diplomacy that you wanted to see, and also construct a discourse, a voice of the emerging political system of Cuba. By the way, a very peculiar country, a country which was decided to be socialist in the middle of the Cold War, a lot of polarization between communism and capitalism, a world full of colonies, very different of the kind of perspective we could have today. And you became a diplomat precisely in those moments. I had to defend the message of Cuba, a message that was being constructed by that moment. Tell me about those years.
I spent the early years in the university. I finally finished my course, and after I finished, Comrade Raul Roa Garcia, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, asked me to work with him at the Foreign Office, and I worked at the Foreign Office for about 2 years.
1962, right?
I joined it in 1962, just before the missile crisis, in September. And one day, Roa told me he had decided that I went with him to the United Nations General Assembly session. That was my first time to visit New York. I went there with him, and we came back after the assembly session, and then I got word gradually they were thinking about sending me back there, but as permanent representative. If you think about it, you'll find it rather absurd. I mean, starting your career as a diplomat from above, as an ambassador, and at the UN is rather unusual, to say the least.
You were not older than 30 years, right?
No, I was the youngest ambassador to the United Nations. I don't know whether there's been a younger one later. The first time I went to New York, I was at 27. And that was a big challenge, because I was the age of young diplomats who were attachés and third secretaries in the other missions. And the other ambassadors were by far old enough to be my fathers. That was very difficult because I was a boy who had to discuss with a gentleman who had a long record and so on. But I had my retribution, because if I was the youngest ambassador, I was also among the few to serve as an ambassador at 2 different times of his life. I served for 12 years during that first time. I returned to Cuba and went back to the UN when the world was completely different. When the Berlin Wall was torn down, the Soviet Union was breaking down, and so on. And my age then was more or less that of the other ambassadors. So, when Roa told me that I had been proposed to be ambassador to the UN, I told him, "But doctor, I know nothing about it." I shall never forget his answer. "Oh, Ricardo, it is the same as in the Students' Federation. You go there and stand up and talk." It is true, I had the practical experience any student leader has, particularly at the time, to debate and argue and uphold your views against any different ones and all that. And university debates were very heated and strong, both before the revolution and during its early years. It's just the same. You stand up there and make your speech and so on. I had some limitations, though. My command of English was so much smaller than yours.
Thank you very much.
But it was a very interesting experience.
How was that message in the United Nations defined in those years?
I believe Cuba's diplomacy was characterized by its creativeness and independence. And regardless the fact that as time went by, we built very close ties with the Soviet Union, there were many major issues in the United Nations on which we differed. Once, Ambassador Fedorenko, who was the Soviet ambassador to the UN, and one of the many who were my colleagues, approached me very respectfully and told me, Ricardo, you never vote with us on all the topics of disarmament and international security. Those were amongst the many topics then. But you haven't even voted for our motion. It was a motion they had presented. The thing was, we had different views. For instance, Cuba would not accept that disarmament issues were controlled by a disarmament committee that existed then and was part of the United Nations. We insisted the whole of the United Nations should hold a World Disarmament Conference to discuss those issues, and I explained that to him. I am talking about this because I believe it is important to state two essential things. First, the independence Cuban revolutionary diplomacy always had, and second, the respect our Soviet comrades always showed toward that independence. We could disagree and have different views, but at the same time, they were our great ally and, to a large measure, our main international support in those years.
Alarcon, you lived the years in which United States and Cuba were closer to reestablish diplomatic relations. I mean, if we don't count what has happened after December 17th. I'm talking about the years of the President James Carter, specifically in 1977. Why do you think the President Carter decided to open intersection and to begin a road of normalization?
You see, Carter was the only U.S. president who openly, even in his platform, when he was running against the other candidates for the presidency, defined as an objective the effort to normalize relations with Cuba. With Carter, various trends came to the U.S. government, as it always happens there. But with Carter, there were very liberal people, to use an American term, and they even went beyond the traditional liberal positions. I found myself in a very complicated situation because Carter appointed an old friend as U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Andrew Young, who was an old African-American leader and had been very close to Martin Luther King. And he became the permanent representative to the UN, the equivalent position of mine, and his alternate representative was Coretta King, Martin Luther King's widow. So it was a rather strange situation because relations between the two countries were so bad. But at the same time, we were friends who had shared many things before he became ambassador to the United Nations. I think it was an attempt by the administration to have better relations with Latin America. Carter was and is a man with ethics, which he has upheld all the time. But at the same time, there was a man like Brzezinski, a rabid anti-communist, a man whose stance on this was much more conservative. It was a time it was possible to have a dialogue between the representatives of the two governments, which might have led to the normalization Carter was announcing. hadn't it been for the Cold War atmosphere pressures influencing that administration, and in particular Cuban solidarity toward two important processes: the struggle in the Portuguese colonies, Angola and that whole story, and Cuban solidarity to the independence of Puerto Rico. By the way, concerning that, Carter made very important moves like the release of the 5 Puerto Rican patriots, there were 5 also, who had been in U.S. prisons. There was Oscar Collazo, who had participated in a revolutionary action against the White House, or the Blair House, where the U.S. administration was then, because the White House was being refurbished at the time. Oscar and another comrade got inside there in a commando action. And there were Lolita Lebron, Rafael Cancel Miranda, and Melvin Flores, who had carried out a similar protest action at the U.S. House of Representatives. I'm telling you this because actually it should have been more difficult to release persons who had acted against the United States, against the empire, openly, than to release, as Obama did finally, our 5 comrades, the 5 heroes of Cuba, who had done absolutely nothing against the United States, who were never armed and would not carry out any violent action. But in this sense, Carter is really a bold man because he was and is a man with convictions. Another point should be made. Whereas Carter first and Clinton later, though perhaps not so consistently as Carter, sought a more normal relationship, the agreements we signed, with the exception of those signed with Carter during the opening of the intersections and the maritime borders and so on, the bilateral agreements were signed with the Republicans, with Reagan, with Bush Sr., and so on, particularly in the migration field. The migration agreements between Cuba and the U.S., which were ratified also by Secretary Kerry recently as being always in force, were signed originally during the Republican administrations, though they were amended and ratified later under Clinton.